Beloved voices like his are not supposed to carry this much pain. For decades, the world heard the warmth in Vince Gill's music, the softness in his guitar, the kindness in his smile. But behind that gentle voice lives a story few fans truly understand. A story of loss that never healed, words that were never spoken, and a quiet heartbreak that followed him long after the stage lights went dark. The first thing people notice about Vince Gill is his calm presence. The way he smiles when he sings, the way his voice seems to comfort people in the darkest moments of their lives. But what many never realized is that the emotion in that voice wasn't just talent. It was memory. It was grief. It was a lifetime of carrying invisible scars. Long before the awards, the standing ovations, and the legendary collaborations, Vince was just a quiet boy growing up in Oklahoma. Music filled the house, but so did expectations. His father believed in discipline, hard work, excellence. Vince loved music, but he also carried the quiet pressure of trying to become someone worthy of that belief. Friends would later say there was always something sensitive about him, something almost fragile. He felt everything deeply: joy, kindness, and, eventually, loss. The music industry welcomed Vince slowly at first. It was not an easy climb. There were years when he wondered if the dream would survive at all. Long nights on the road, small stages, endless uncertainty. But even during those difficult years, people around him noticed something unusual about his voice. It sounded honest. That honesty eventually opened doors. Collaborations with legends began to happen. Nights spent sharing stages and stories with some of the most respected names in country music. Vince was not just another singer trying to make it. He was becoming part of something bigger, a community of artists who trusted him, admired him, and slowly welcomed him into their inner circle. But fame has a strange way of hiding pain rather than healing it. Behind the applause, Vince was already learning how fragile life could be. One of the first deep wounds came through friendship. In country music, friendships run deep. These artists travel together, perform together, and often become like family. And when tragedy strikes someone in that circle, the pain spreads quickly. The loss of fellow artists shook Vince more than people realized. The country music world has seen too many voices fade too early. Each time it happened, Vince felt it personally. These weren't just headlines. These were people he laughed with backstage, people he shared songs with, people whose voices once filled the same rooms. He rarely spoke about how those losses affected him. Vince was never someone who liked to place his grief in front of cameras. Instead, he carried it quietly. Sometimes it came out in his music. There are songs where you can almost hear the weight in his voice, notes that tremble slightly, lyrics that feel too real to simply be performance. Fans often describe those songs as beautifully sad, never realizing they were hearing fragments of Vince's real memories. But nothing prepared him for the heartbreak that would strike much closer to home. Family has always been the center of Vince Gill's world. For all the fame and recognition, those closest to him say his greatest joy was always being a husband, a father, and a son. The stage was important, yes, but family was sacred. And that is why the quiet tragedies that touched his personal life cut so deeply. Life cut so deeply. There were moments when the public saw Vince smiling on television while, behind the scenes, he was fighting to hold himself together. moments when music became less about entertainment and more about survival. Those closest to him noticed it first. There were nights when he stayed longer in the studio than usual, recording again and again, as if trying to capture something that words couldn't quite express. Friends remember the silence that sometimes followed a performance, the way Vince would sit alone for a while before joining the others. Not sadness, exactly. They were looking at a man remembering something painful, the kind of memory that never truly fades. And yet, through all of it, Vince kept showing up. Night after night. Song after song. Because, for him, music was not just a career. It was the only place where his heart could speak freely. But the story of Vince Gill's deepest heartbreak, the moment that left an emotional scar that still lingers today, begins with a phone call that changed everything. A call that came on an ordinary day. A call carrying news no one is ever ready to hear. And the haunting words spoken during that moment would stay with Vince for the rest of his life. If you want me to continue, type continue, continue. The call came at a moment when Vince Gill was not expecting his world to shift. It was one of those quiet afternoons that blur together when life is moving quickly. Rehearsals, studio conversations, the routine rhythm of a musician's schedule. Nothing about the day hinted that it would become one of the most painful memories he would ever carry. When the phone rang, Vince answered the way he always did. Calm, polite, focused. Something heavier. Something unfinished. Many fans believe the saddest chapter of Vince Gill's life came from the grief he carried for someone he loved deeply, a loss that changed the way he looked at life forever. Though he rarely spoke publicly about the details, the emotion behind certain songs made it impossible to hide completely. In quiet interviews, Vince once admitted something that surprised many listeners. He said grief never really leaves. It simply changes shape. Those words were not philosophical reflections. They came from experience, from moments where the world expected him to be strong, while his heart felt like it was quietly breaking. And then there were the regrets. Every life contains them, but for artists who travel constantly, the feeling can be even sharper. Missed phone calls, family events attended through rushed visits, conversations that get postponed because there is always another show, another flight, another commitment. Vince would later admit there were moments he wished he could rewind. Words he wished he had spoken sooner. Time he wished he had spent differently. For a man whose music often celebrates love and devotion, those quiet regrets carried enormous emotional weight. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Vince Gill's story is how little he allowed the world to see. While other stars built images of perfection, Vince simply kept singing. Fans saw the gentle performer, the award-winning musician, the kind-hearted collaborator who always seemed ready to help another artist. What they didn't see were the late-night phone calls with friends when memories resurfaced, the quiet tears after certain songs, the moments when performing a lyric felt almost unbearable because it reminded him of someone he had lost. One close friend once described watching Vince perform a particular song and noticing something change in his expression halfway through. It was subtle, but it was real. The smile faded for just a moment. And in that brief second, the audience wasn't looking at a country legend. They were looking at a man remembering something painful. The kind of memory that never truly fades. And yet, through all of it, Vince kept showing up. night after night, song after song. Because for him, music was not just a career. It was the only place where his heart could speak freely. But the story of Vince Gill's deepest heartbreak, the moment that left an emotional scar that still lingers today, begins with a phone call that changed everything. A call that came on an ordinary day. A call carrying news no one is ever ready to hear. And the haunting words spoken during that moment would stay with Vince for the rest of his life. If you want me to continue, type, continue, continue. The call came at a moment when Vince Gill was not expecting his world to shift. It was one of those quiet afternoons that blur together when life is moving quickly. Rehearsals, studio conversations, the routine rhythm of a musician's schedule. Nothing about the day hinted that it would become one of the most painful memories he would ever carry. When the phone rang, Vince answered the way he always did, calm, polite, focused. But the voice on the other end was not calm. At first, the words didn't seem real. News like that never does. It arrives in fragments, in half-sentences, in pauses that feel longer than they actually are. For a few seconds, Vince simply listened, trying to understand or demand what he was hearing. Someone he loved deeply was gone. People who knew Vince well say that moment changed something inside him forever. Not in a loud, dramatic way. Vince Gill has never been the kind of man who collapses in front of cameras or makes grand public displays of grief. His heartbreak was quieter than that. But it was no less devastating. The loss struck him with the kind of finality that leaves a person standing in silence long after the conversation ends. After he hung up the phone, friends say he didn't speak for several minutes. He simply sat there, staring at nothing, replaying the words again and again in his mind. There are moments in life when the past suddenly becomes very heavy. Every memory begins to glow with a different meaning. Every conversation you once had with someone now carries the painful awareness that there will never be another. For Vince, that realization was unbearable. The person he had lost was not just family. They were part of his emotional foundation. Someone who had watched him grow from a quiet boy with a guitar into a man standing on the biggest stages in country music. Someone who believed in him before the world ever knew his name. And suddenly, that voice was gone. Grief has strange ways of showing itself. Some people cry immediately. Others move through the first hours in complete disbelief, as if the mind refuses to accept what the heart already knows. Vince fell into that quiet disbelief. In the days that followed, he tried to continue working. Studio sessions had already been scheduled. Commitments had been made months earlier. The world of music rarely pauses for personal tragedy. But something about Vince had changed. Friends in the studio began noticing it almost immediately. His voice sounded different. Not weaker, but heavier, as if every lyric now carried a memory attached to it. One musician who worked with him during that period later said there was a moment when Vince tried to record a song and had to stop halfway through. Not because he forgot the words, because the words suddenly felt too real. He stepped away from the microphone and apologized quietly. No explanation, no dramatic moment, just a man trying to regain his composure. That was the way Vince always handled pain. Silently. The country music community soon heard the news, and messages began pouring in from friends across the industry. Artists who had shared stages with him for years reached out with their condolences. Some called, others simply sent quiet notes. Quiet notes.